Go for it.
So, Among Us is it's a murder mystery game with like a spin on it. So, as a crewmate, the goal is to complete all these tasks that the game gives you randomly, and you have to do that before the imposters kill everyone, or you have to figure out who the imposters are and vote them off during the meetings. So the meetings happen whenever like a body is reported. So you can report bodies and you can also call emergency meetings. And your goal as a crewmate is basically to work with others to finish tasks before the imposter kills everyone, or figure out who the imposter is and vote them out before they kill everyone.
Right, and it's really that last part that kind of drew a connection for me, like figuring out kind of a truth claim, right? And you do that by people discussing their propositions, their observations, their deductive reasoning based on those observations, and then collaborating with others to verify kind of what they saw or what they didn't. And also be attuned to listening for things that just don't seem right, or they don't add up and they don't make sense, right? So by kind of learning some of these abilities to do logical reasoning and also identify some of the things that are kind of off track of that logical reasoning, you can learn to not only play Among Us better, but also just navigate life much better. So let's jump into this hybrid presentation. All right. Okay, can y'all see that? Okay. Once it loads. Can you see that? Is it full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, this bar is really annoying. It's in my way. Thank you. Okay, bam. Here we go. Okay, so we are here to suss out the fallacies, find the truth, and win. Okay, so Anish gave us a great background, but basically you need to complete tasks, observe others, use reasoning and cooperation with your teammates to vote out the imposter. Imposters pretend to do the same, but kill, deceive, and lie about their actions and intent. Getting to the truth of the matter is a life or death proposition is maybe what I wanted to say. So it's important to know what is sus. Okay, so that's just a brief background for anyone who hasn't played. At some point you vote for each other, so you discuss among each other kind of what you saw, what you think. To really briefly refresh, we're going to kind of circle back and figure out what logic is first, and then we're going to kind of go into some of the reasons and ways that it can go off track. Simple words, logic is the study of correct reasoning, especially regarding making inferences. Logic began as a philosophical term and is now used in disciplines like math and computer science. Logic is a process for making a conclusion. Can I get Rohan Ray, read the first line for me?
The foundation of a logical argument is its proposition or statement.
Great. Erica, can you read line 2?
The proposition is either accurate, true, or not accurate, false.
Arav, line 3.
Premises are the propositions used to build the argument.
Good. Sia, line 4.
The argument is then built on premises.
Anish, line 5.
Then an inference is made from the premises.
And Anika, line 6.
Finally, a conclusion is drawn.
Okay, so you see how that works. You need to have a proposition, you establish it with true or false premises. These have to be truth claims that are testable, verifiable, and then you build the argument based on those premises. And finally, an inference can be drawn, or you can make your inferences and finally draw your conclusion. That's kind of how logic is supposed to work. We have informal logic and formal logic. Some of you might recognize the rapper in the GIF there. But basically, informal logic is what we use every day, right? It's like, oh, I think that this is going to be the case because I've seen that 100 times before, so it's probably going to be the case, right? But these aren't things that are necessarily true. So for example, in Among Us, you might have Blue say, or someone say, I saw blue running around aimlessly. All crewmates are supposed to have a task and a place to be. Therefore, blue is not a crewmate, right? Can anyone think of like a reason why blue might not have been doing a task?
They finished all their tasks.
Yeah, sure. They finished all their tasks. Maybe they're like a noob and they don't know where to go. Maybe they're just like grabbing a drink of water or something. Like you just don't really know for sure. So that is not a good use of formal logic. Moving down to the bottom, it says, in formal logic, you use deductive reasoning and the premises must be true. You follow these premises to reach a formal conclusion. So for example, a better use of formal logic would be something like only imposters can vent. I saw White vent. Conclusion, White is an imposter, right? Now that's probably true for you. Convincing other people of that is going to be a different story because you have to actually explain things and kind of collaborate. Okay, we're going to get into the actual logical fallacies now. Many of you from years past you will remember the fun video we've watched probably multiple times. I think it's called the Fallacy Project on YouTube. Look it up. It goes through a couple of these, but it's just quite a bit dated. So I think we needed to update it a little bit. Okay, the first one, I've probably talked to you about this one before. It's called ad hominem. So an ad hominem is when someone attacks kind of the person speaking personally and doesn't really address what the content of their argument or their statement was, right? So you might see stuff like, green is the color of envy, so you can't trust them. Well, obviously that has nothing to do with whether or not they're an imposter this game, right? Or vote purple, they have a robot and only villains have robots as sidekicks. Obviously you can pick whatever skin you want. It's going to be the same whether or not you're a crewmate or an imposter, so that has nothing to do with it, right? Or vote white, big hat equals big cap. Yeah, so like none of these has anything to do with the likelihood of someone being an imposter or not, right? So all these things about identity really are not good or useful statements to be using when trying to get to the truth. As we go through these, I would love it if y'all could like chime in before I move to the next line with either a real world example of this kind of being the case or just like another example in Among Us, if you have it. So does anyone have an ad hominem attack that maybe you've heard in Among Us or like elsewhere that is just doesn't make any sense?
Oh, this person was imposter last time, which means that they can't be imposter this time.
Exactly. Yeah, actually that's what I had for green before, but I was like, yeah, that kind of is also like other ones too. So, but yeah, it's like what they were last time has nothing to do with what they'll be this time. So that is like a personal directed attack. Doesn't make sense. Okay, next one. The bandwagon. This should be one that most people have heard about. If you haven't, you could probably figure out what it means. Sorry, my Zoom slide thingy is not in the right place. Okay. Bandwagon is basically when you believe something because everybody else believes something. This is actually surprisingly powerful. And let me just say, like, a lot of these logical fallacies are fallacies of formal logic. They are not bad ideas, right? Like a lot of what we see here today are like shortcuts to coming up with answers because these kind of work in a day-to-day basis, but they can't work when you're trying to be sure, like, is this thing true or not? Or are there other explanations for something? So getting onto this one is called the bandwagon fallacy. So would anyone like to read this for me? Just the definition.
Considering an untrue statement as fact / simply reliable simply because a large number of people believe it. Popularity alone is not enough to validate an argument, although it is often used as a standalone justification of value.
Good. So you see how that would be a bad reason to vote for somebody right there? Well, I mean, actually in Among Us, probably not a terrible reason, but if the first person was the imposter and they were like, oh, vote orange, right? And then everyone's just like, oh, well, I'll do what the other person did. You have all you know, not helped yourself in any regard. So you need to make your own independent judgments on a lot of things by reviewing the actual data yourself and not just deferring to the opinions of the majority. Oh, what's a bandwagon fallacy in real life? What's a time when like everybody does something because other people are doing it?
Downloading TikTok is a good idea.
Ah, beautiful. Everybody's doing it. I should do it too. Oh God, 6 months later, we haven't seen you. Yes, indeed. All right, next one up. Appeal to authority. I know you guys like this one right here. Would someone like to read the definition? All right. I will call on someone. Let's see. Tanish.
Appeal to authority. Relying on statements from perceived authorities without reviewing the data or reasoning offered. While appeals to authorities are by no means always
Fallacious. Oh no, what happened?
too heavily on the opinion of a single person, especially if that person is attempting to validate something outside of their expertise.
Okay, good. So appeal to authority is actually something we do in debate quite a bit, right? We use evidence, we use authorities, experts all the time. But ideally, we are using experts and evidence and statements from them about things that are within their field of expertise. We would not go to, I don't know, what's a good example? Like we would not go to a refrigerator expert to build, you know, a rocket for space, right? They may be the smartest person in the world when it comes to repairing refrigerators, but not when it comes to building rockets. Similarly here, if you happen to find yourself in a game with AOC, just because you agree with her energy policy and stance on criminal justice reform is not a reason for her not to be the imposter, right? So when you're, oh, well, I trust that person in this regard is not a good reason to trust them in all regards, right? Or on things which they are not an expert or don't have the data. Can anyone think of another example of like when we do an appeal to authority that is fallacious? I don't know what kind of like authority Rudy Giuliani has these days, but that might be a funny one. Okay.
Oh, sorry,
Go
I thought of one.
No, go ahead.
I remember last year one of the topics there were on the predictive policing topic, most of the evidence was like from the predictive policing companies that people were referencing.
Right. Oh, perfect. So we are the foremost authority on predictive policing data because we own it all, because we developed it all, and we are selling it to you. It's like we can totally trust that. It's obviously in some cases there's also the chance of bias from your experts, right? Because they have, you know, they have a stake in things, but also there's, you know, reason to suspect that they have some reason to manipulate the data as well. But also you wouldn't consult those predictive policing people on like, what is the best, you know, benefits package for police officers? Like that's not their area of expertise, right? All right, next. All right, I had a real trouble with this one actually. I couldn't think of a good analogy for straw man in Among Us or where you might see that. But straw man basically oversimplifies and misrepresents your argument to make it easier to attack or refute, right? This is kind of hard to think about in the context of Among Us, but for example, if White came in and says, "Oh, I saw a red in the med bay, not scanning, that's sus, so I left," and called the meeting. And then red's like, oh, sure, you saw me, but then you turned around and left. Since crewmates all know where they're supposed to be going, anyone turning around when they get into a room is clearly looking for easy murders and not doing tasks, right? Like latching onto one element of what they said and really attacking it, even though that's not the thrust of what they were trying to say. So straw man argument is maybe a better example here is in the real world, right? So like if you get an anti-Black Lives Matter movement person saying something like, oh, so you're just calling for abandoning all police, huh? Well, who are you gonna call when criminals try to burn down your community and murder your family, right? You hear that trope put out there a lot. But if you talk to BLMers, that's not what the movement is really asking for. It's asking for accountability, reform, reprioritization of some of their resources. So, you know, when you just paint their movement as a movement to abolish all policing order of any kind, then it's easy to attack that, right? It's much easier to attack a lawless, chaotic, anarchical world than it is one where there's like minor sensible reforms, right? Does that make sense? Is any other straw man argument pop in anybody's head?
Yeah, Trump does something similar by like calling everything fraud, right? Like mail-in ballots fraud, as well as like in general, just like fueling his misinformation campaign, which is an example of the straw man argument because he's purposely misrepresenting it to make it seem like it's not helpful when in fact like it is.
Yeah,
so,
or you know, or latching onto these kind of like extreme examples and really throwing them out there as like the norm. So this idea that there was like foreign manipulation of the digital counting, right, is something that is being thrown out there that has not been proven, but it's like enough of a distraction to make it seem like, oh, if that happened, that would be awful. And it makes us kind of distracted and deceived just enough to stop focusing on what the truth is, right? Any other ones on this one? Hasty generalization. This is probably the most common type of logical fallacy you will see anywhere in debate in life. People look at something, they make a judgment, and then they act on that judgment. But that judgment has incomplete information. They couldn't see everything they needed to see before they made their call. So this is basically about acting and deciding to do something with incomplete evidence, right? So it's when you draw expansive conclusions based on inadequate or insufficient evidence. In other words, I can't read what's on the right. They jump to conclusions about the validity of a proposition with some but not all evidence to back it up, and then overlook potential counter arguments, right? For example, I saw green in the cafeteria near a vent, and since imposters can vent, they're the imposter. In reality, green could simply be paused at that location because they had to use the bathroom, right? Or was waiting for an imposter to reveal themselves by coming through the vent, or is a noob and doesn't know what they're doing. So there's a lot of different explanations for someone who would be hanging out by a vent, other than just being an imposter looking for, you know, a way through, right? So let's not make hasty generalizations. Does anyone have any real world examples of this one?
Oh, like most racist claims.
Yes, good. Like this one just smacks squarely of racism, right?
Yeah, that's like the most common one.
Yeah, this one and one you'll see in a bit, anecdotal, right? Where you have one particular experience, or maybe on the news media, you see this one particular crime and you use that to paint the large majority of the criminal activity happening in your neighborhood or community. And that could be a cherry-picked or misrepresentative example and could really kind of distort your perception of kind of what's happening on a larger scale. This is like most things in debate. So like, and the point here is not that like calling these fallacies out by their name is how you win debate rounds. The point is you have to look at people's logical arguments from a variety of angles and figure out where they're trying to manipulate and distort information, right? And knowing the name is useful, but really pointing out how it doesn't necessarily follow is what is more important. Okay, the correlation and causation fallacy. So if two things appear to be correlated, that doesn't necessarily indicate that one of those things irrefutably caused the other one. This happens quite a bit. So here you might hear, oh, I always die in the engine room. Therefore, the engine room must be killing me. Like that can't happen, right? Blue was next to an electrical panel when an electrical task was completed. Blue is a crewmate. Sure, that could mean that Blue completed the task, but it could also just be coincidence and he was standing there when someone completed an electrical task somewhere else on the ship. Is that a thing that can happen? I don't play this nearly enough. I played like 6 times. I know just enough to try to make these things work. Are there multiple electrical panels? Help me out.
Well, you can't see like who completes like a task in a specific area. You can just see like tasks in general. So someone could complete a task somewhere else, and you could think it happened in electrical, but it happens.
See, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
And
So,
now you can play with like without the taskbar too, so that doesn't always apply.
oh, yeah, no thanks. I want more information. Right, so like you could be standing near one panel on one side of the ship and someone else could complete it on another. And if you're looking at that one person, you're like, oh, well, they probably just completed it. You would be wrong because you can't necessarily know what's happening at the other panels. We see this sometimes like in a lot of data that we will review, right? For example, having a higher degree usually means you have a higher income. So if you are wealthy, you are well educated. Why does that not necessarily follow? And while those two things may be correlated, they don't necessarily cause the other thing. What are examples of wealthy people who may not be highly well educated?
Paris Hilton.
Bill Gates.
Paris Hilton, good. Celebrities, Bill Gates, college dropout, tech startup person, right? There's lots of those going around. I think quite a bit. And people are now like skipping college in many cases, just learning programming and getting hired by some of these companies. So it's not necessarily true that you have to have a high degree anymore. Other people who are quite wealthy without high degrees. Have you seen the contracts coming out in this NBA offseason? Have you seen Danilo Gallinari get like $160 million for 4 years and he doesn't even necessarily, he's not even necessarily a starter. Athletes would be one of them, right? People who were born into wealthy families, I'm sure many of them go and get degrees, but you know, recipients of familial wealth don't necessarily have to be well educated. So, you know, those things that may be correlated, but they are not causal. Okay, can I get, how about Safik? Can you read this anecdotal evidence definition?
In place of logical evidence, this fallacy substitutes examples from someone's personal experience. Arguments that rely heavily on anecdotal evidence tend to overlook the fact that one, possibly isolated example can't stand alone as definitive proof of a greater premise.
Beautiful. Yeah, so like what happens to you, even if it seems like a pattern, is not necessarily what's happening everywhere, right? So this is what we kind of talked about earlier, right? Every time I'm killed, it's yellow. Therefore, yellow is always the imposter. You can see how that's wrong, right? That may be your experience, but there's nothing about being yellow that makes you more or less likely to be an imposter. So good. And then going back to that statement made about racism, right? Like we see this happen quite a bit in racism, or people who justify racist beliefs. They're like, well, look at all the crime that's happening. It's this particular group, or you see it in this particular area. And a lot of times that's not actually right, but that's the imagery that is kind of projected to these people. So that's what they see, and they only can really speak to what they see. And that's what the fallacy kind of implies. It's anecdotal, right? It's only your experience, and it doesn't necessarily, you know, apply to the greater experience. So, how do we overcome anecdotal reasoning? What's the antidote to anecdotal? I know someone knows this. What is the opposite of anecdotal evidence?
Maybe empirical.
Sure. So empirical, but like comprehensive, right? Objective has indicators that are the same for everybody who is measured. It measures the entire population and not just a subset of it. So the more meta your data, the better and less anecdotal it is, right? Because people can cherry pick data sets too. So in vaccine effectiveness, for example, if you just look at one patient who you gave the experimental vaccine and they didn't get corona, your anecdotal evidence says that it is 100% effective, but we know that that's not the case, right? If you look at a cherry-picked group of like 30-year-olds and it's 100% effective, that's cool, but that might not be representative because that's not representative of the population as a whole. So vaccine trials need to kind of be tested on a wide range of ages, health backgrounds. They won't allow it on children or pregnant women as far as I know, but you do want to have a wider group. You want to have minorities in your study because oftentimes they're overlooked in these kind of FDA trials. So yeah, you want more data. The more data you can have, the more sure you can be that your individual observation is not an outlier, but is rather representative of something larger. Okay, middle ground fallacy. This one's fun. This is like the problem of the news media over the last 20 years. Mohol, can you read this one? Are you there? Okay, how about Priscilla?
The middle ground fallacy assumes that a compromise between two extreme conflicting points is always true. Arguments of this style ignore the possibility that one or both of the extremes could be completely true or false, rendering any form of compromise between the two invalid as well.
Good. So here in Among Us, you might see something like white sus, red, also sus, can't decide, let's vote pink. Like, you see how that makes no sense, right? Like, it could be white, it could be red, but like pink is certainly not it, right? I mean, this is a weird example because these are like Schrodinger's cat, like yes or no propositions, not kind of like a middle ground thing. But other examples. So you might hear this is the most secure election in US history from the US Homeland Security or National Security guy, whatever. Versus there was widespread fraud. This is a rigged election. That does not mean that the truth was it was a moderate amount of fraud, right? Like it was substantial, probably several 100,000 votes, not the million that the president alleges, but it was probably 100,000. Like that is not true until you can actually have evidence of that. You can't just assume that the midpoint is always more likely to be closer to the truth. Similarly, with these stimulus package negotiations that are going on, like what do Americans need to survive this dark winter, right? The Democrats put out the relief package back in July that was like 1.3 trillion or something, and Republicans came back with a $600 billion number. So it does not mean that like the best number is the one in the middle, because if the Republicans are right, that could still break us in terms of national debt. If the Democrats are right, that could still lead to 10 million businesses or individuals losing their jobs permanently. So, it's important to know which claim is true or false and not simply settle on the middle ground between two opposing viewpoints. All right, the next one. Volunteer?
I can do it.
Go for it.
The burden of proof. If a person claims that X is true, it is their responsibility to provide evidence in support of that assertion. It is invalid to claim that X is true until someone else can prove that X is not true. Similarly, it is also invalid to claim that X is true because it's impossible to prove that X is false.
All right, y'all should be familiar with this, right? Burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof in debate typically?
The F.
it starts with the AF, right? The AF needs to prove that there's a problem, that it's not being addressed, that the plan can remedy the problem, all of that, great. And then you want to run a disad. Who has the burden of proof to prove that like the disad will happen?
Neg.
The neg, right? So when you want to run one of these arguments, it's your burden of proof. And you cannot say, well, they haven't proved that it's not the case, therefore I have proven that my thing is the case, right? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. That was something weird like that Rumsfeld said. That's not actually what I want to say here, but all right. So this would be akin to Red as the imposter saying, don't vote Red because no one witnessed me kill anyone. Therefore, I could not have done it, right? So if Red's proposition is, it's your burden to have seen me kill someone, you didn't see me kill anyone, so I could not have done it, right? Until you prove that you saw me do it, you cannot accuse me of having done it. But we know that you have to use logical reasoning and deduction and other clues to figure this out, right? Not everyone is going to see someone do a murder. Similarly, we saw this in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where, basically the national security figures were like, well, we don't have any evidence that they're developing weapons of mass destruction or that they have them, but we can't have any evidence that they don't have them. So we might as well just go ahead and invade, right? That's not a quote, by the way. That's basically kind of what he was saying. Also, Colin Powell was kind of on board in that. But the idea here is that like, and this is the same thing happening with Iran right now, right? Or North Korea. We can't prove that they don't have a weapon, so we better treat them very seriously as a result, right? We better, act as if they do have a weapon when we haven't proven that they do. Well, in North Korea's case, they do, but Iran, yeah, maybe they're still going after civilian stuff, or maybe they're doing both. We don't know. Okay, next one up is the red herring fallacy. Would someone like to read this one? How about Irina?
A distraction from the argument, typically with some sentiment that seems to be relevant but isn't really on topic. This tactic is common when someone doesn't like the current topic and wants to detour into something else instead, something easier or safer to address. A red herring fallacy is typically related to the issue in question, but isn't quite relevant enough to be helpful. Instead of clarifying and focusing, it confuses and distracts.
Good. Red herrings can be hard to identify sometimes because they seem related, but it doesn't really advance the discussion that is at hand, right? It is often, it's kind of a way of reorienting the conversation to something that is more comfortable for the person uttering that fallacy, right? Here we might see, so as the imposter, a use of a red herring might be, oh, if I report the body, then they will never suspect me, because why would I do that? That would endanger me. They would suspect me. So if I do it, then they will suspect that it's not me, because I would never do that as the imposter. You see how that kind of goes? Like, you're throwing out a distraction to distract from the fact that Red just murdered somebody and they're standing near the body, and you're like, oh, no. The reason is because, I reported it. And so it's a way of distracting from the issue, which is that Red is, clearly the imposter here. Because can anyone think of a red herring in real life? Someone throwing out a distracting argument?
Maybe like in some debate, they like attack the person's personal record with that issue or something.
Okay, yeah, that would be both sort of an ad hominem attack, but also a red herring. So it's like if you're supporting criminal justice, or you're on the neg of like criminal justice reform, and you're like, we need to have law and order, and then the affirmative gets up and says, well, didn't you donate money to the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer? So how can you, reconcile those two positions? Obviously, that has nothing to do with your argument in the round or your proposition. It's like a personal thing that's a distraction, because that's not having to do with the statements that were made in the debate. Good.
Oh, tricks.
What was that?
Tricks.
Trips? Explain that.
Tricks, like tricks
Oh.
debating.
Okay. Tricks debating. Yeah. So like when you throw out all these like independent voters and weird theory arguments and little things like you must prove this or you lose type weird things, it's like those are not really about the debate or the truth claims of the debate. They're just little distractions that hopefully tie you down into a time suck, which is why they're usually run.
Well, they're
Okay.
testing the truthness of the debate.
Sure, at all times with great veracity. Beautiful. Okay, Ronick, personal incredulity.
Give me a sec. Is it just me, or can like for me the slides aren't showing up? I've just been hearing audio.
What?
Yeah.
They're working for me.
It's like, please.
Maybe it's like my Wi-Fi's glitching.
They're working for me too.
It's just like a black screen on my end.
Oh, my bad. I hope that's not the case for others.
Let me just disconnect and try rejoining. I think it's just a Wi-Fi thing.
Yeah, no problem. Does anyone else have that issue? My God, please speak up if you can't see the slides.
Oh wait, it just loaded too. I can read it.
Okay, great.
Personal incredulity. If you have difficulty understanding how or why something is true, that doesn't automatically mean the question is false. A personal or collective lack of understanding isn't enough to render a claim invalid. I think an example of this was like Anisha and Tanish had a debate round where the other team was just like, we don't understand what set call is or what your big words of ontology are, so obviously it's not true.
Right, indeed. So like you can not understand something, but it could still be true, right? Like your attempt to explain it could be very bad or it could be wrong or off track, but that doesn't mean that the thing itself is not in fact true. So for example, a noob in the voting discussion might hear something like, oh, everybody is saying that Green was in the med bay was sus because he wasn't scanning, right? And then I don't understand what that means, so I'm not going to vote for them, right? It was sus. Like Green was the imposter. They should have been scanning and they weren't, and that's a good indication that they were the imposter. But because Green didn't understand it, they didn't vote, and that hurt them because now the imposter is still alive, right? Or maybe I don't know. Yeah, so I think that was a good thing to mention, Ronick, that oftentimes in debate, just because you don't understand your argument doesn't mean that you're wrong, right? Or doesn't mean that the judge won't vote for it. So it would be best if you understood it, but you should not lose simply because you don't understand it. If you've laid out a cogent argument, then it should stand. It helps to be able to explain it, but it's not necessary for it to be true. All right. Oh man, I don't even know how to say this one. Like I want to pronounce it like Spanish, but it's Latin. To coque? Quoque? Anyone have any? Anyone take the Latin here?
We don't go to Bellarmine.
Do they really do Latin at Bellarmine?
Yeah, they do Latin at Bellarmine. Because I shadowed Eric Gottlieb and I went to his Latin class.
Wow. Well, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Like that. All right. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read this one?
Yeah, I can.
Thanks.
I'm not going to. I don't know how to pronounce that. So
Give it
the
a try.
fallacy.
I don't know either. I don't know.
So the fallacy, which is Latin for you also, is an invalid attempt to discredit an opponent by answering criticism with criticism, but never actually presenting a counter argument to the original disputed claim.
Sadly, this is like 80% of our politics today. They call me a racist. No, you're racist because you said I'm a racist. Like, it's really that base, and it's not very helpful. So, for example, Red says, "I saw blue vent." What would be the "you also" fallacy for blue to respond?
I saw red vent.
Oh, yeah, well, I saw red vent. Like you have not gotten any closer to the truth. You have not disputed that Red observed you venting. Like you didn't say, no, I was here, I was there, it couldn't have been me. You're just like, no, same criticism right back at you. And that gets us nowhere, right? Because we have not discussed any kind of anything to determine whether or not that was true. Here's just a couple more. There, by the way, there are like 80, 100, like however you want to list them. I put the sites of some of these definitions, and I'll share this presentation with you all afterward, but there's definitely more out there. A couple of the other ones that you may come across are like the false dilemma. So that proposes that there are only two choices, when in reality we know that there's many other options. What's a good false dilemma that the affirmative often points out? When there's a counterplan run.
It's the AF or the squo.
Right. And there could be a perm, right? Could be the best idea, or yeah, the counter,
like an alt or a counterplan.
Right. Well, that's what I was thinking of, right?
Oh.
So get an AF and a counterplan. Well, a perm may be the best way to avoid the net benefits and solve the AF, right? The Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So that's a funny name, right? But the idea comes from like a sharpshooter just like takes out his pistol and starts shooting at the barn, right? And then he goes up to it and he sees the grouping of bullets and he's like, oh, well, this grouping is like in this area, so that's where I was aiming for, right? But in reality, he wasn't aiming at all. He was just shooting. And then you look at the grouping and you're like, oh, there's some sense here. Like this must have been the intention, when it was never the intention. It just kind of is how the chips fell, right? The fallacy. That's a fun one. This is kind of like the personal incredulity one. Bad arguments and justifications do not mean that something is untrue, right? So yeah, I can't think of like a bad argument. Anyone want to come up with a fallacy?
I could say that I've never been bombed with a nuclear bomb, so nuclear deterrence must be true.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful. So yeah, nuclear deterrence is true, but it's not because like you personally haven't been bombed, right? So that's not a great argument, but the truth claim is still true. Very good. And then a favorite is slippery slope. Negatives like to take slippery slope as truth. See any disad ever run. The slippery slope is steep. It's more like a cliff that we are teetering on. But basically it says that one thing does not necessarily follow from another thing. So if we spend an extra $1 trillion, it does not mean that the US defaults on its credit, which then does not mean that the US enters a recession, which does not mean that the world enters a recession, which does not mean that we start fighting over resources, which does not mean we lead to nuclear war. It's like there's so many steps in that thing that you saying the plan spends a lot of money does not necessarily mean that it leads to something quite awful.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say deficit spending is really cool.
Deficit spending, right? Like we deficit spend every single year. The deficit the debt gets higher and higher, but we all just deal with it, right? Because money is just kind of whatever we need it to be, without having too much inflation. Okay, so these are the examples that like the blog thing came up. It's about, it's kind of putting you in the context of a small business having to make decisions and listening to people on your team kind of making suggestions, but then listening for what might be wrong about those suggestions, okay? So can we take the first one? One of our clients doubled their conversations after changing all of their landing page text to bright red. Therefore, changing all text to red is a proven way to double conversations. What is that? Which fallacy is that?
Correlation, not causation.
Yeah, several of these are going to have like multiple right answers, but
okay.
The key word here is like one of our clients, right? So that might be more like an anecdotal, but yeah, I think that as well. The next one, oops, clicked it too early. Someone says the best way to improve is to change. The other one says don't, so they decide to change half of the stuff, right? That's the middle ground fallacy. That doesn't make sense. Next one, I don't understand how redesigning our website resulted in more conversations or conversions. So there must be another factor at play. Does anyone know this one?
The personal incredulity fallacy.
I think so. Yeah, Good. Very good, right? Just because you don't understand the way something works does not mean that's not the way it worked. Next, Barbara believes that the marketing agency's office is haunted since no one has ever proven that it isn't haunted.
Burden of proof.
Yeah, this is the burden of proof fallacy. Next, 2 members of my team have become more engaged employees after taking public speaking classes. That proves that we should have mandatory public speaking classes for the whole company to improve employee engagement.
Is that anecdotal again? Because it's only a few of them.
It could be anecdotal, yeah. I think anecdotal hasty is maybe what it is. Any others? Correlation, not causation. Right, yeah, because we don't know that it was the public speaking that led to them having more clients. Engaged employees, yeah. We can either agree with Barbara's plan or just let the project fail. There is no other option.
False dilemma. False dilemma is like the most common one. People make that one all the time.
Yeah, and so you'll realize, like, as a debater, when you don't have like the perfect evidence or the perfect logical chain of reason, like, you're using these. Trust me, you are using these all the time, and it is up to the opponent to point out why they are not good enough, right? It is in your interest to use these logical fallacies so long as you can get away with them and so long as you don't lose entire credibility. But saying that there are only 2 choices here, either you save these people or you risk global war, is advantageous to the affirmative, right? Or whoever wants to make that kind of like dilemma claim. Hasty generalizations work a lot for people who want to kind of paint your affirmative as causing some terrible consequences. So the point is not that these are terrible to use. The point is you need to be able to identify them, call them out for what they are, and figure out where the gaps in the logic are so that you can attack those gaps and not waste time just saying like, oh, no, I don't think so. Or remember my first argument. You actually have to respond to what is wrong about these arguments. All right. Victory. Mitty debater.
That was so awesome, Mr. Woodhead. Thank you so much for creating for everyone.
Of course.
And a thank you in advance for, I know that captains are creating other lectures. I really appreciate it. Just one last reminder, you guys, I forgot to say earlier, I saw a couple of you have taken up these